I'm here today with Dr. Tamara Fountain of Rush University in Chicago. Area of expertise is oculoplastics. And you wear a couple of hats as being the director of the board of OMIC. You gave an amazing presentation of giving us some real specific tips of how to prepare ourselves to prevent litigation and also how to deal with litigation. And I really think I'd love to share that with other members. So let's start with, what shall we start with? Informed consent?
I think some of the things that we see, and the beauty of risk management talks really is that we all learn from our mistakes. The great thing about risk management talks is you're learning from the collective mistakes of about 4,000 of your colleagues, because that's about how many cases we've amassed over the 25 years of our company's existence. And so it allows us to see trends and to identify those trends so that our practicing doctors and even people who are not insured by us, we want this to be an ophthalmology benefit because our mission is to provide information to the sphere of ophthalmology. And what we see trends, I think, if I could say the top issue that tends to get us into trouble is, believe it or not, missed diagnoses. We are all well trained for the most part, and we have busy practices, and one would think that when we miss a diagnosis, it's because it's something very esoteric, something very unusual and very uncommon. But our data does not support that. Our misdiagnoses tend to be very common things that we learn the first month in residency. Intraocular foreign bodies, retinal detachments, and intraocular infections top the list. Those are very basic things, but what I think gets people into trouble is that they lose context and they lose focus. We're all busy, we tend to run behind, and we sometimes lock into what we think is going on, and then we close ourselves off to recognizing that there might be something else going on. So I think one of my pieces of advice would be that if you have a patient and their course is not going like you think it should, or if they're deteriorating despite the treatment that you think they should be given, it would behoove you and the patient to take just one step back, go back to your basic training and think, what is the differential diagnosis of this symptom complex? And almost always it's going to be right there in front of you. Misdiagnoses are part of about 80% of our top cases have to do with missed diagnoses. So it's an area that we could definitely work to improve upon.
And I think your point of these are common diagnoses is really critical. Where these aren't the zebras, these are the horses.
These are
retinal
the horses.
Detachment, glaucoma,
and intraocular infections.
Okay, well that's a really important list to keep in the back of our minds that we're constantly asking ourselves. And we're also going to talk about informed consent, because I think you gave a great presentation about this and the elements that are in informed consent.
People may get tired of hearing about informed consent. It's somewhat of a bureaucratic detail. We want to think of it that way. But the reason why it's so important is we know in medicine as physicians, we're acutely aware that we can't guarantee a result. And we know that there are complications, and every patient that we operate on is different in some way, and their outcomes will be different. That's not necessarily a common knowledge for the patients that we treat. And so the informed consent reminds us that I need to remind this patient that things don't always go well, that the odds are overwhelmingly in their favor in most cases, and when they're not, we need to be very honest about that. I know in my heart of hearts that the odds of them coming out okay are great, but I need to remind them that it's not 100%. And this acknowledgement will help us because it will make for a more informed patient. There are people who, if they think there's any chance at all of vision loss, they're not going to do something, and that's their choice. But it also fosters, in order to have that conversation, I've got to spend time with you. I've got to look you in the eye, and I'm going to develop a relationship with you. So in part, it gives you some protection as well, because about 70% of all litigation, if you boil it down, comes to some type of communication breakdown with the patient. So this informed consent back and forth and dialogue, and it really is a dialogue, not a monologue, will help to foster that relationship. And just to remember, when everything you've done correctly and you have a complication, Informed consent is like the back door. It's the one area where you're still vulnerable for a known complication that you can open yourself up to litigation if you've not executed that informed consent process correctly. So that's why I think we keep talking about informed consent regularly and often.
And I thought when we talk about informed consent, you gave a couple of tips that were really critical. Number one, giving the patient a copy of your consent, and also consenting them before the surgery, not the day of surgery.
Yes, it's nice to give them a consent because it is overwhelming, I think, for some patients. They hear what you're saying, but it's always nice for all of us if we're able to go over things in writing afterwards. And so if you give the patient the copy, it allows them to, at their leisure, go through it and ask questions. They can call your office, they can come back and ask questions, and it's another defense against the allegation. The patient could say, well, yes, I signed Dr. Fountain's consent process, but I was dilated, I didn't have a chance to read it at the time. And that will prevent that from being a valid excuse because they will have had it for several weeks. And ahead of time, it just means that none of us would ever force a patient to have a procedure done. But sometimes if we wait until the day of to have that discussion, the stakes are higher then. They've taken off from work, they've changed into a flimsy blue hospital gown, and their family members have taken off from work. So at that point, they're probably going to be, if they are afraid about something, or if they have questions, they're less likely to want to rock the boat at that point. And so that sense of pressure could come back and say that you sort of forced this upon them. And that's why, except in unusual extenuating circumstances, emergencies, etc., you should be having the discussion about what could possibly go wrong well in advance of the procedure.
And finally, you showed some statistics that really are sobering.
Yes.
About the percent, my chance of being sued during my career.
I know, that's always, I never want to leave an audience feeling desperate and resigned, like they have no power. But the reality, unfortunately, in our society is that over the course of an average 30 to 35 year career, our statistics show that 95% of us will be involved in this litigation process. And so it's not really a matter of if, but really when. And I think it's important to take away the stigma. If you've ever gone through this, it can be a very isolating experience. The legalities are such that you cannot, once you are involved in a suit, you cannot discuss the facts of the case with anybody outside of your attorney. And this is a time when you probably need support the most, and you can't seek it from the normal sources. And so your malpractice insurance company will have claims people, they'll have risk management people to walk you through the process, to hold your hand. It is unfortunately simply an aspect of doing business in our country. But the good news is, despite the odds of getting sued, the likelihood of your case getting dismissed are much, much higher. So 80% of all of our cases end up going away. Either they lose interest, they realize that they don't have a case. So you'll probably be involved in it, but the odds of you paying out or being found negligent are much, much smaller. That's the good news.
That's great news. I want to thank you. You have brought so much valuable information to this meeting, and your work on the OMIC board has been really tremendous, and we've all benefited from it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan, for what you and what WIO has given to me over the years as well. Thank you very much.